What's the best way you've gotten back at a dickhead boss / coworker? At the age of 15, I was doing humble freelance work designing a restaurant menu for a small business owned by family members. The owner insisted I would email the entire completed menu just to look at it. I was told a printed copy didn't cut it. I had not yet received any payment, and they made it pretty clear they just wanted to start printing copies and not pay me. So, I make the entire menu have the watermark superimposed on it. Not with my name, not with a logo. With the word poop. I explained that it would be removed when I got my money, which I did. I worked as an installer in a remote office. I traveled a lot for work, often spending weekends on site. This was fine under my old boss, who gave me a lot of leeway by letting me work from home, gave me comp time, etc. After 4 years, I got a new boss. Also, the company laid off everyone in my office, about 100 people. New boss insisted I come in anyway, 45-minute drive, to sit in an empty office. But I still had to travel Sunday through Friday, with no overtime, and no comp time. When I complained 2 hours, the hour manager told me that since I'm salaried, if they wanted me to work 80 hours a week, I would work 80 hours and I shouldn't expect any compensation. Everyone I talked to seemed to think this was true. Salaried equals get overtime. This didn't make sense to me. I called the local state Dept of Labor office, told them what I did, what I'd been told. They told me to get a lawyer, and if they didn't rectify this, for every dollar they owed me, they would have to pay the state 50 cents in penalties, which is what I did. In a matter of 4 months, I settled out of court, got a new job, got a severance, and made my boss do an exit interview, where I told her if she'd been halfway considerate and legally complained, she wouldn't have to scramble to cover for the next stage scheduled installs by flying people out from the East Coast and paying them overtime. Worked in a bakery / lunch and sandwich shop / coffee bar. I worked in the back as a baker. I took the orders from all the smaller coffee shops around town that the local chain owned and baked all the bagels, cookies, muffins, wraps, etc. Occasionally we had catering orders, to do which added a significant chunk of time onto my day. My asshole boss didn't feel it was necessary to tell me about them until the last possible moment. There's a lot of prep work that goes into making 1,000 ham and cheese sandwiches. Prep work that can be done days in advance. Things like slicing all the cheese and meat, or mixing our own mustard. He didn't give a fuck if I stayed until 3 AM on a school night. I was in high school. Most of the time I didn't care that he broke child labor laws. I kind of wanted the job, but finally the straw that broke the camel's back was the 3rd catering order he didn't tell me about a week in advance, like he should have. It was a huge, important luncheon for the company itself, feeding over 3,000 people. I had to make hundreds of baked goods and sandwiches, and about 30 quarts of 3 types of soups. He told me about all of this 18 hours before it had to be loaded into a truck and delivered to the event. I sighed at him and said I'd take care of it, but I called him an asshole for not telling me a week in advance. I can make the soup and refrigerate it. All sorts of things to cut down on my workload. I had a test the next day and I wanted to study. This was at 5 PM the day before. He left for the day. I was the only one capable of making all the food that were on staff. I told everyone else on staff what he did, and since there's a mutual hatred among my co-workers, they all agreed not to tell him the next thing I did. I walked out without preparing an ounce of food. I left a note on the table in the back, calling him an inept moron incapable of managing a simple lunch diner and incapable of being a social person. I suggested he be more considerate and kind to his employees, should he demand such respect from them. I walked out and quit. Not even 2 weeks notice. Fuck that guy. When I came back for my paycheck a week later, he tried to intimidate me in his office while handwriting my check. He said, "Name, you know, that's not the best way to make friends." I replied, "Yep, I generally try to make friends by being nice and respecting people. You should take lessons from me. I was the smartest kid." As far as I know, he got fired for letting 3,000 people go hungry at a huge corporate event. only kind of related, but had a verbally abusive boss who would make physically impossible demands and thought she was queen of the workplace. Which she was, cause her supervisors let her do whatever, even after I reported all this. So during one of her tantrums, in which about 12 hours of work is being laid on me at 4 PM, that has to be done by tomorrow, I tell her, fine, I quit. You can't quit. You have to give 2 weeks notice. What? No, I don't. Goodbye and good luck with all that work that needs to be done before tomorrow. Very satisfying. I made a girl fat, and not by marrying her. In 2003, my office got a new secretary and a new manager. The secretary, or thin blonde, was a vile she-devil. She wouldn't do anything the staff asked. Find info, set up calls, get coffee for anyone who wasn't herself, and the manager wouldn't do anything about it. We joked that her job title was Internet Quality Control because she more or less sent personal email and played on MySpace all day, to which when she overheard, literally went to the manager in tears. Then one day I got a rather large jar of candy as a gift and she just about single-handedly consumed half of it, which pissed me off good. Then later that week, I brought in a dozen donuts and she ate half of them on her own. Upon putting the facts together, our web designer, editor and I decided to fuel the fire in something we called Operation Butter Up, where we each in turn brought in a large bag of candy to fill up my jar as fast as she could empty it. In the course of 3 months, she put on 20 pounds. In a year's time, she unrecognizable, and along with being a crank, she was an idiot and couldn't figure out how. Several times a week we provided her sweets and snacks of every kinds until her boyfriend dumped her, which was about 8 months into the project, and she had to get a new wardrobe. We lucked out because she was rather stupid, but we had more diabolical measures lined up if she stopped eating the candy, along the lines of mixing in weight gainer to the non-dairy creamer she was using, and things of that nature. That was 2003, and she's still big to this day. Saw her on Facebook and smiled at our handiwork. Still single to this day, and I would like to think that we had something to do with it. I was a typesetter when it was still done on dedicated typesetting machines, not desktop. This is pretty specialized work and demanded pretty good pay. I agreed to take one job at less than my usual hourly pay for 6 weeks while I learned their system, one I hadn't used before. Well, 6 weeks came and went, and I didn't see my promised raise. In the meantime, the horrible shrew of a pastoop artist went out sick, and I was left doing both type and layout. A very important project came up, and there was only me to do it. Without me, they'd be totally and royally fucked. Even if they could find a typesetter who could do pastoop, there was just no time to run the ad, hire, and train one. I reminded the owner and manager of the raise I'd been promised when I was hired, and how long ago that was. Then I put all my personal desk choxes in a box and told them they had until end of business to make a decision. I got my raise, retroactive to my hire date, by 5 PM. I used to have a boss who was an asshole. He was the manager of the clothing store I worked in. He tried to hire young girls under legal working age. Here that age is 16. They were usually 13 or 14, so he could try and sleep with them. He sexually harassed every girl he worked with. We were a small retail store of 6 or so employees. I ended up having to phone our head office several times to stop him from hiring underage girls and from harassing the employees. And by harassing, I mean groping, talking about all the dirty things he wanted to do to girls, etc. He used to take 2-hour breaks when we were short-staffed/busy, paid himself overtime every week, and often would not show up for shifts, forcing the person who was already on staff to work overtime, which we wouldn't be paid for, because he would modify all our time cards on the computer until he decided to show up. I also knew, while he was working during his shifts, he would put on merchandise to try it on for size, and then would conveniently forget he had put it on, and would leave with it. It took a long time of planning to get my story straight with how I was going to catch him, but eventually I got him to text me, admitting to having not paid for something he'd taken. 1 week later I used the texts as evidence to have him fired. Then I took him to court for all the threats/harassment he'd been doing over the last 10 months of working with him. Our company was giving us employees an appreciation lunch and had requested a small group of employees to plan and execute the event. On the day of the event, upper management got to stick up their butts and decided that the planning committee was using up too much company time. They told us that any of us who worked the luncheon, serving and cleaning up, would have to do it on our lunch breaks or stay late to make up the time. We of course found this unacceptable. Prior to the luncheon we had a huge meeting where all the managers and big wigs praised all the workers for a job well done etc. and at the end asked if anyone had any questions or comments. I stood up and in a very friendly manner said that we needed managers to volunteer to serve the luncheon. All you heard were crickets for about 10 seconds and then a lot of whispering and scrambling as upper management made lower management raise their hands. It was so awesome to see them all using their lunch hour to serve us. Close bracket. I worked in the IT department of a rather large law firm. A guy I was sort of friends with that worked a couple desks down from me had kind of a bad attitude and ended up getting into a long feud with the tech support manager, who was, admittedly, a stupid cow. He ended up getting fired over the feud and I think just his general attitude. He called to tell me about it the night it happened. I was working on a project after hours, so I wasn't there when it happened. The next day, my boss calls the department into a meeting to tell us that my pseudo friend had quit, but that because he was in it and had access to all the passwords, that they were not allowed to give him 2 weeks notice. This was, of course, complete bullshit. Everyone knew that he got fired, and everyone knew our boss was lying through his teeth. So, fast forward about 6 months later. I had just come through being scapegoated big time for some stuff I wasn't even remotely responsible for, and I could see the writing on the wall that they were working on building a case to get me canned. It just so happened that I got a job offer through a referral from a friend that worked at another company. So, when the offer came through for about 6k more, I did a little dance, and then I shut the hell up. My girlfriend was a flight attendant at the time. So we planned a little last minute getaway between jobs. The day before we were scheduled to leave for Europe, I came into work, did my best to close out all my issue, put out any fires I could, for the sake of my coworkers, and then I marched in and handed my boss my letter of resignation, effective immediately. He read the letter, there was a long pause, and then he asked me when I wanted my last day to be. I looked at him for a minute, savoring the trap, and reminded him that, because I had access to all the sensitive system passwords, I wasn't allowed to give/take 2 weeks notice. His jaw hit the ground, he muttered some sentence fragments, and it was pretty clear I caught him in a lie. The best part was, while we were living it up in Italy a few weeks later, I checked in on my bank account at a cyber cafe, and saw that my direct deposit had cleared a check for the pay period for 2 weeks after I left. So even though I didn't work it, I was given my 2 weeks notice and salary. That extra paycheck essentially paid for an extra week in Europe. And that extra week was by far the best part of the trip.